We're good.
Awesome.
So, do we want to talk about jigsaws first?
Yeah, that's fine. Sure.
Maybe I should pull up my really fast. Sorry. Mine had to do. Well, we all had to do the everyone part, so I guess we could start with that if we'd like. I can gather my stuff.
Did anyone else find the poverty one kind of confusing?
Poverty?
Like the leaving poverty behind?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was hard to follow. There were like bits of it that I held on to, but yeah. I think like the when it was split
definitions at the end.
Yeah, like on that third page, I thought that really helped. It was like the interaction and like that helped
definitely.
Because I never really understood micro interaction, and then it was like, oh well, it's just like that. Everything affects our behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, says, how did you see power being wielded in? Was that for everyone? Like, actually, what did everyone read? You read City of the Beast.
Mm-hmm. I read House of Scorpion.
Same.
City of the Beast.
Oh,
split again.
Nice, but different this time. That's awesome.
Maybe we can just like talk about it out of the books.
What
happened.
Yeah.
Maybe a quick overview of the plots too.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure because there's science fiction too. It's weird. I don't personally. I know you talked about that. Like you've never like shied away from it, but you've also not seeked it out, and that's where I'm at with science fiction or fantasy. I've never been really moved by it or interested so much in it. Mm-hmm. Honestly, before that book, I read like the one that I can think that I read was like The Giver, and that's it. Mm-hmm. And I never read like any of the Harry Potter or the Twilight or
me neither.
I don't know. I don't know why like I didn't. I think it just wasn't something interesting to me. I like prefer like realistic fiction type stuff. So and I think so when I read The House of the Scorpion, I couldn't say I really liked it. Like it was like the reaction of like what the Giver author was talking about in her video, like people were scared of it. And I wasn't scared of the Giver, but for some reason I just didn't like the vibes I got when I read The House of the Scorpion, just with like how people were treated and just how terrible that was, and that they like set it up so that they could treat them so poorly because they were just clones. And so anyways, I don't know if either of you have read The House of the Scorpion before, but it's about.
I read the description, which I thought was like pretty detailed.
Yeah. So it's just about a city, Opium, I think is the name of the city.
It's a country.
It's a country. Yes, mm-hmm. Yes. But a little bit a ways from what used to be Mexico, and they like clone humans so that they can use the clones to give their organs and stuff to keep or the original humans living for longer. And so there's El Patron, who is like the main guy who has the highest power, and he has his clone Matt, and it's all a lot from Matt's perspective throughout it all, and like how he like struggles with his identity because he's like, well, I love El Patron because he's me, and he loves me because I'm him, but mm-hmm. he has still the power over me because he didn't want to believe that he was using him for his organs, and he ended up being able to get away with not, but anyway.
That's deep.
Yeah.
Like intense.
It was intense. It was. And a lot of the time I was kind of like, okay, I need to reread that. I'm confused, and mm-hmm. I don't know why, but yeah, so I guess I wasn't maybe like when reading. So invested in it because I was kind of just weirded out. I don't know. So
I was really into the setting of it and like this alternate future. I agree. A lot of the things that happened were pretty disturbing and like definitely threw me off at first. But once I got into like the history of it, I was like, okay, this is interesting. Because what it posed was that America and U.S. It kind of like predicted this alternate future of what could happen if the border conflicts kept getting worse and worse and worse between Mexico and the U.S. And so it was talking about there's always drug dealers and immigrants trying to sneak across the border. And then what this El Patron guy did is he like rose from poverty and was like, I have this brilliant idea. I have all these farms along the border already. I'm going to propose that I make it my own country. And like he and the other opium farmers were going to like rule this like tiny strip country that runs along the whole border between the US and Mexico. And with that, he kind of built up this mercenary army that like stopped all border traffic in either directions. And then Mexico became Azlatan. I forget. And then the U.S. stayed the U.S. And then it kind of like predicted what would happen if they like both continued to develop industrially on their own. And so there's technology advances and stuff. And yeah, it was crazy. And then with the production of that country, it was like Mexico-U.S. communications stopped.
Interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot.
I feel like our book was not as
like our book was intense, but not
like
I've
that.
actually before.
It's just like more intense of like a journey. Like it's more
like one journey, not all these different.
Yeah, like they go on different journeys within this big like. So they're trying to find the beasts, and like to get there, they have to overcome. They being like the main character, and then pretty much just at like towards the end, this one friend that he meets, and they have to go through like trials, I guess, to like overcome certain things to get to the beasts. And then once they get there, there's even more like issues and difficulties and stuff, and it has to do a lot with just the indigenous people and how Western civilization will come in and like, you know, force upon their scientists. And like there's one guy tried to like kill all the indigenous people by giving them a vaccine that would give them like a disease that would kill them.
Wasn't it like malaria or something?
Measles.
Measles, right.
Yeah. And so like that was like the like more intense part, like similar to your book, but other than that, it was more of just like a dramatic, like adventure of like overcoming challenge and like individual challenge and stuff like that.
Did you like it?
I mean, no. I'm not into fantasy. Yeah. Like, and I really tried.
I'm into fantasy, and even I thought the story itself was kind of interesting, but it was written so weird. Like the perspectives, I was like, I don't understand what's going on. I feel like it just wasn't written well.
Yeah, I totally agree. It was hard to read because it was referring to just even like the dialogue or something was hard to read because it would switch between like Alex, so Alex is the main character. It would switch between like Alex said to like his perspective, like coming. So like there would be like an outside narrator looking in onto the book and everything. But
then it would also like refer to his grandma. But then it would be like what she was thinking, but it didn't tell you that's what was about to happen.
It would transition really quickly in and out of this like outside perspective to like in the story, and it was
from like every different person. So I was like, what is going on?
It was different in the sense of like, you know, they didn't say like mom and dad; they called them by their first names, which was hard to.
Only sometimes though.
Yeah, he would refer to them as mom and dad, but like when there was dialogue, it would be like Lisa said. Or something. It's like, wait a second, who's Lisa? Like, And
I felt like we had a lot of names to follow too.
There was pages of character names and their relationships to each other at the beginning of ours, just to help you back.
Oh my gosh!
So
I looked for that. I just went straight to the
family tree and everything to help you keep track
Did I
of
really
everything.
just not even go and look at any of that? Oops.
No.
I think our book made it more complicated than it needed to be because, like, there was one character who was his grandmother, and it went back and forth between calling her grandmother, Kate, the writer, and like it would call her by like 4 different things, and I was like, why can't you just call her one thing?
Yeah. So like
they did that with several of them.
Oh my gosh, this would have made things so much easier for me. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, like I didn't really like it. It was really hard for me to read. But I also like it brought new.
Oh my god. I did not know I had that lid off. I'm so sorry. Wow. I'll just use some.
I'd get you a napkin, but
I'm so sorry, Corey, for getting your thing wet.
Oh, it's barely wet. Don't worry about it. It was mostly just like
Sorry
right there.
Thank you. Oh my gosh. Lid is off. I need to screw lids on. Oh my gosh. Wow. Probably the most exciting video she'll ever get. Okay. I'll just let that dry. Thank you. I'm going to screw that on. I'm just not even going to get water anymore. Sorry for the distraction, guys. I did not like my book either, but that's just because I'm not a fan. So I guess I don't really know how I'm going to encourage, or not encourage, but as a teacher, if we want to bring these things in, have these discussions, like I'm going to have to figure out a way to be passionate about it. I don't know.
It like brought a lot of new perspectives of like, because when I think of fantasy, or like when I did think of fantasy, I thought of just like a, all of like in Tunnel, when he describes the different types of fantasy and just like the different characteristics that they include with like, a secondary world, an element of magic, and like all that kind of stuff. So like that's what I would picture, but I didn't picture like legit social issues or something like being so incorporated into it. Like, I think of like the Harry Potter, and yes, there's like social issues and stuff in there, but you don't really like see them. Whereas this is like, killing off indigenous people and like, really hitting on historical facts. And so like, that's something that was new to me. And
that's true. That was for me too. And it provided a new light to like how you could read these differently, and how, I just kind of read it for what it was at first, but then like when I went to go back and critically think about it and how it was set up and like what roles each character had in their society that they had created, it was just like
there's so many different things.
Class systems, border crossing, integration.
Totally. Like, there's so many different roles that were played among all the different characters, and like I was trying to figure out like which, some are very obvious of like what would be higher in power, but then some of them I wasn't really sure. Like I felt like anyone that wasn't El Patron or Matt, I just thought that they didn't really have any power at all. But then it's like, well, then there was like a senator and then Maria who were, a senator, like what power. I wasn't really sure what kind of power they had and like how they helped El Patron making decisions, or if they didn't really and they're just there and had that label. I don't know.
I was really how the power relationships changed throughout the story. And sorry I interrupted you, Tristan.
Oh no, I interrupted you. It's kind of hard to tell. But I just have a really quick question before we go into power and stuff, just because I think that the like idea of having like this historical information in fantasy is really good for a lot of kids because, some of them do enjoy fantasy. Like I enjoy fantasy over realistic. But I was wondering, because like, I don't think our book was well written. Do you think your book was well written? Because obviously we need to have like well written books for the kids.
No, I think it was well. Okay. Like it was easy to follow.
Okay.
It's won 3 different awards.
Yeah.
And it was it's definitely for older kids, because it's a lengthy chapter book and there's a lot to keep track of.
Ours was fairly lengthy too.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I wonder if this was, I don't know, supposed to be.
And one thing that occurred to me about you guys' book is actually when I first read it, it was for a Spanish class, and I read it in Spanish. And I don't know if it was originally written in Spanish or in English.
Oh.
The
author is Chilean.
Yeah, Chilean, yeah.
So if it was originally written in Spanish, maybe like the translation just kind of.
That's a good point.
But I don't know which language it was written in originally, so that would like change that. If it was translated, it might say at the front with like the copyright or something.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense though, like if it was translated.
I kind of I read like the Wikipedia after I read it on the House of the Scorpion, and it kind of talked about the author and like how she came from like she wrote from like an experience she had in helping like immigrants over the border and like all the stuff she had to go through, because I was like really curious, like, okay, how did these authors like come up with these things? Like, where does it stem from? I don't know. And so I guess, yeah, I just was amazed at like from like her experience, although it probably was somewhat similar, like how much she could imagine after that and create herself. I was impressed by that. But yeah, I guess it's possibly important when you're bringing these books in the classroom to like see kind of again like how we're supposed to critically look at the authors and like where they're coming from. And I don't know if your book probably too had the author or writing maybe from a past experience and then making it fantasy, but
yeah,
I
think so. And I think just like the setting is really like, you know, from that area and like that maybe like there's this very big idea of like different worlds. So they go into like this, like they find like the city of beasts, which is an dormant volcano, and like they come across like the indigenous people and they're called the people of the mist. And so it's like they all kind of represent different groups, I guess, but they're not real. Like, so
yeah.
What was that? But yeah, this is translated.
Okay.
Translated.
So maybe
well, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
That's probably why.
Yep.
That's funny.
I was gonna say about our author for the House of Scorpion. I liked that. I don't know if you saw at the back, but there was a little blurb by her. And it talked about what you said you found on Wikipedia about her experience with helping this person across the border. But then it also went on to say there's like an interview question along the lines of like, do any of these characters come from real life inspiration? And she like listed like half of the characters in the book were like inspired by people she knew. So I think something for like fantasy authors is like they're imagining this crazy setting and stuff, but it's still rooted in real people. And that I kind of connected that to the reading in Tunnel. Yeah, that one where it was like talking about truth in fantasy and how it's like still talking about real human emotions and experiences, even if it's like set in these far off places or magical worlds.
I talked about that. I don't know if I wrote it down. No, I didn't, but I highlighted it. I remember it was at the end. It talked about like some of the most important things is to connect it with human. Did I really not highlight it? Well, I thought I did. Yeah, I don't know where I found it, but it talked about how it's like really important when writing or finding texts that are like fantasy where there's still like plenty of room for students to relate in some way to the characters. And so it was kind of hard. Maybe that's why I also wasn't so interested in the House of the Scorpion, was because I didn't feel like I could relate a lot to any of the characters very much. Like I talked about in my post how like the stretch I could go was like struggling with your identity and like having like the social pressures on you that you're not worth anything, and how like women experience that in society, and like that they have so many ways to improve themselves based off of like this one image, and like how Matt was like told like he's an animal, he's terrible, but then Patron came in and changed his whole view. But then anyways, so it was harder for me to connect with the book, but
I think it's like when you don't necessarily like fantasy, that's when it's harder to, just like anything, it's when you don't necessarily enjoy it, like it's harder to see yourself in it. Because, and also I feel like maybe fantasy is a little bit more difficult anyways, because yes, it has those human characteristics that people are like attracted to, but like it's not necessarily like a realistic fiction or something like that, where it's just like, I've done exactly that before. Like you can't just like, you know, you've never gone on this adventure like this or like anything, so it's a little bit more difficult to.
That's true.
To connect, I guess. I also think it goes the other way too, of like making it a little bit harder to pull like the message or the themes out of the books, because of, I think like for me, like I got caught up in like the actual like adventure and journey and everything, and not necessarily like, oh, look what they're doing to these indigenous people, like, you know, like I recognized that, but it wasn't like oh, this is like a message and a theme and like a huge issue that this author is addressing and stuff like that. Like I felt like it got a little bit more lost.
I think that kind of like focus on a theme is a little more present in books like The Giver. Like, you've all read that, right?
Yes. I actually haven't.
I don't know if I have.
Well, like, you know what I'm talking about. Like, it's kind of like the whole point of the book, like the whole theme is kind of that underlining like what's happening in their world and like what the problems are and what's causing their world to be that way, whereas like ours, which it sounds that's like kind of how yours was a little bit too, but ours was more of like just an adventure. Like, I mean, obviously there was the underlining thing, but it wasn't my main focus all the time. My main focus was like, oh, what's gonna happen next? Like, what are they gonna do? Are they going to find the beast? Like that kind of stuff. It wasn't like, oh, these indigenous people are being mistreated and the white people are coming in and taking like their stuff.
I think ours was a little bit more heavy-handed just because it literally...
Yeah, that's what it sounds like.
Crossing the Mexican-American border. But yeah, I remember kind of what you're talking about. It's definitely with the involvement of like their magical spirit animals. Like it was very much more focused on like the childhood,
the mystical and the
right, and like the growing as an individual, like overcoming that challenge.
Kind of a coming of age story.
Definitely more of a coming of age story, I feel like.
I looked at like a summary online just to like see if I could find like what exactly the author wanted, like a theme or something like that. Just because like I kind of had an idea, but and it really talked about like the fact that it was coming of age, like this thing where the character is really challenged with his identity and like his assumptions of like people, which is like really cool. I mean, I think most books kind of touch on that, but and then it really talked about how the author about Western science and industry and the effects of non-Western groups of people, and then also politics and environmentalism, were like the three
were present, but they just weren't what stood out to me.
Right, and like that's what I went looking for, is like what's supposed to be standing out. But I don't know, it's kind of like I think if you were to like teach this book with older kids, like you could read it, talk about like the themes of like the identity and challenges and stuff like that, and then kind of go back and be like, let's look at this part of it, and like maybe do like more of a history like lesson and like that type of thing of, you know, past occurrences, and then like how does that apply now and stuff like that, kind of pick at it that way. But
like dive into those specific moments where it did show up.
Right.
Yeah, where it was really easy to identify a person with a way of thinking.
Right, where like your book may be like during it or something like that, you're talking about immigration and stuff like that, whereas it's not like let's go back and find it. It's like so prevalent that.
Yeah. There's a lot.
What do you guys think of The Stranger in the Mirror book, the children's book?
The one with Sam.
Yeah, it had a lot of messages behind it, and like I don't know that I would have like necessarily saw those if Joy didn't talk about it. Like to think about like how old people are treated and like how they are in our society differently from other societies, and just it's just interesting to think about, and like makes me wonder like where that started or if it's always been that way, like in United States with like that we just send them off, usually like the majority just send them off to like be taken care of by other people, not your own family, and like
especially because a lot of cultures like really value the older
and like why has old people become a burden to most families? Like I think that's so sad, and I don't know, just like where and why did that start? I don't know. But I don't know that I would have thought about that and like the way that he was treated once he switched or woke up a grandpa, like how, like I don't know that I would have noticed like, oh, they're treating him poorly or something. Like
I would have only thought that they were treating him poorly because like he looked different and they're like, whoa, what's wrong with you? Like what just happened? Not so much like he's an old man, so I'm gonna treat him like an old man.
Yeah. Would like kids see that like at a young age? Like if you read that to them though, like I think it was quick to understand with when Joy brought that up. But I mean, it would be hard to say like, oh, all kids are gonna understand. They're gonna understand that. But at the same time, do you think like they're still like at an innocent stage where they just see their grandparents in their lives, but they're still together, and they just it's exciting when they come over, or they don't have grandparents at all, or
but I also think like there's a when you're younger, like at least like in my experience, like I would love them to like my grandparents to come over, but it also was like then I couldn't hang out with my friends, or like it was kind of like that, and then that was like I don't want them to come, like because I couldn't hang out with my friends, and that was literally the only reason. Like, and it was fine when they were there or whatever, but like if a play date had to be canceled or like if something like that had to be changed, then it was just like I don't want them to go.
I guess that kind of shows that we still aren't like so under the impression of valuing them so much, and
and it's also like if you read this book, then like you can have a whole range of if you have like a lot of different cultures or something in class, and like you can kind of like talk about like different cultures and how they treat elderly people, and that might be like a cool like first-hand resource to have like different cultures be like, well, we do this and we do that, and like what about your grandparents? Like
that's a good point.
Or I don't have grandparents, or just everyone's different experiences.
It definitely made me think of one of my friends who for a long time, even though he was out of school and had like a salaried job and was making plenty of money to live on his own, he still chose to live at home with his parents because his grandparents lived there too. Like they all lived in one house together, and he felt it was his responsibility to stay and help take care of them all. Really? And when he finally moved out into an apartment on his own, it was like 5 blocks away. So he like had his own space, but then he was still right there. And he said, when my parents reach that age, like they're gonna come live with me. Like family was really, really, really important to him. And he's like, yeah, I could never imagine sending them away to a home.
Yeah. Well, like, and I have a friend who's from Nepal, and like he grew up there until he was in 8th grade, or like 13 or whatever, and then came here. And like as the oldest boy in like his family, which he only has one other sibling and younger sister, but like he is like now he has a job, like he went to college, and like it's really really like he's just like a cool story and just an awesome person. But like now that he has a job and everything, and he's always been like responsible for taking care of the family and everything, and so he's like, once he gets like a house and everything, then the family will move with them. And like him leaving like the house to get his job in Seattle, like it was like a huge like, I mean, really really hard time for his family, just because like that's like their like that's just how their family works, and like how their culture works and everything, and like they'll just move with him and he'll provide for the family and everything. And you know, he went to school and in our hometown, and like just lived at home. Like there was no option of living, you know, away from home because he was with his family. So it was just like I don't know, like that's another example of just like something that's like really cool, that like family just is looked at differently. And I think like as like, at least for me, when I get like as I get older, like I'm more and more and more thankful and like appreciative of every single member of my family and everything. Whereas like when you're younger, you kind of just like, like you're just all over the place. It doesn't really matter. Like,
that's true.
Yeah, but I liked the book. I think it was a good one.
No, I liked it too. I realized that I wasn't really exposed to much fantasy picture books growing up, like in school. Like that wasn't really prevalent. And I talked about this in my post, but the only one that came to mind was like the Case of Bad Stripes or whatever, where that was like, okay, a lot of kids could relate to this and the fact that they have to stay home, but none of them are gonna have their skin change colors like that.
And, like Charlotte's Web. Or something like that, talking animals.
That's true. The talking, I guess, maybe there is a lot then with talking animals. I feel like that's an easy go-to.
I think like with fantasy, like children's book or like literature, I guess, is to me fantasy seems so simple. Like when I like think of fantasy, I think of like Harry Potter and the, you know, like the crazy like mystical world type of thing. Whereas like fantasies literally can just be like one thing. Like the boy just changes from grandpa and then back to himself. And there's like two instances of fantasy, and everything else is like normal, but there's like other elements of like, well, you don't know if it's actually true or not. Like it kind of leaves you hanging and like that type of thing. And so I think like for me, I totally overlooked like that part of it. It wasn't until Joy said that like, you know, that part I'm like, oh yeah, like, well, that didn't really seem like fantasy, but I guess it is fantasy. It is.
That's true.
It's simple, it seems like. It just seems very minimalist with the fantasy.
Yeah, and maybe that's like better for younger kids versus like what we read. Obviously, they wouldn't be able to read that and like fully comprehend or understand it if they're like second, third graders or something. But that I feel like could be even more helpful for us as teachers to highlight on like one point and teach them about it than like have a whole world to like unpack with them on like this means this, or what do you think about this and this and this and this. Like you don't have to do that with like the picture books, because it's just simple fantasy, like one thing to focus on and how that's affecting the person or the social structure.
I think that fantasy definitely is for like a higher level readers, because even our like we just took the ELED 481, I think, and we were studying fantasy, and that was all like grades 3 through 5. Like we were reading fantasy stories with 5th graders, and they were even like less like in depth than I think your guys' novel was. So I feel like fantasy, even the picture books that she read to us had like a lot packed into them, I think, which is why this one was nice because it was more simple. But I feel like a lot of them still do have a lot in it. So
also think about like the fairy tales. I mean, you grow up like that's a type of fantasy, like it's like you do grow up with all these fairy tales that don't.
That's true.
Fantasy
That's a good point.
And
there's a lot.
But like, and I think like every book you could like you know, you could pull so much out of The Stranger in the Mirror and everything, but like you could make it super simple too, like just very like applicable to younger kids and stuff. And I don't know, like I guess just like that idea that we do grow up with fantasy, and it's just like that imaginative, like just using your imagination and like going to like a different place or a different realm, or using something that's true.
One of the benefits of those folk tales and fairy tales that I remember is that they often use very similar archetypal characters in all of them. There's always the evil person. There's always the hero who has to conquer some trial. There's always the obstacle in its way. Sometimes, you know, there's the wise old person that advises him along the way. And so that like starts getting kids like used to like, okay, I can expect these characters. Now what's different in the stories? And then when you go from that to fantasy, it's like, whoa, now the characters are different. They're not all fitting these archetypes perfectly. What's going on?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Which is why I love fairy tale modern renditions, where it's like rewritten, and like Grimm's fairy tales, there's dozens and dozens out there. Book series and stuff of like rewritten Grimm's fairy tales, and they're like all different, and the characters are so much more complex, and every single one, my mom and I like devour them.
I love them. Have you ever read Sisters Grimm?
Yes, that's one of them.
They're so good. I love them.
Did you guys watch the read aloud, I guess, of the instructions, like the code?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I
liked that poem.
Yeah, I thought it was really cool how it just like hit on all the different fairy tales, and like you can just like oh, I think that one's that one, and like I think that line is for that one. And
I didn't even connect that. Like, oh.
Yeah.
I was just like, oh, this is a typical, you know, like fantasy thing. Like I like seeing all the different like typical fantasy parts in his poem.
Yeah.
I think it took until halfway through that I caught it, and then I had to like, you know, I scrolled down and like reread the written version below, and I was like, oh, we're rewriting her. What's going on here?
That's funny.
Right.
Well, that makes more sense to me. Having all these questions like, okay, how did he put this all together? Like, why did he put this with this and then choose to go that route? What's the purpose in this? I don't know. But I mean, I liked it, but I was like, it's so confused.
I just felt like I was like all of a sudden like walking through a bunch of different fairy tales, like, you know, going through the woods and going through the house and going, seeing the animals and like the wolves or whatever it touched on. So I liked it.
Yeah. Now I like it more.
It would be, I think, a really cool poem to do with like older elementary or
I liked how you said like start with an introduction to that. And I'm sure like if you do it with older elementary, like they probably would pick up on that because that's fresher in their minds too, you know, like all that they've read is going to be all those fairy tales probably, and so they'll pick up on it pretty quickly. And I just agree with you that it would be a great introduction to fantasy series or whatever.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about the wealth inequality in the United States video and the Angel City video?
Oh yeah.
I like just looked at the module and remembered that. Okay, I really liked the wealth video. I liked a lot because I felt like the graphics were really easy for me to understand. Like I'm not good at understanding any government, anything, or like economics. I can never understand it for some reason, but I really like that video because I thought it like showed it really well. And it was just crazy to see the difference between like the poorest and like the very richest in our society. Like even our ideal was not good, but it was way better than what it's at, and that's just so sad. And I don't know.
I talked about how just like, you know, I've seen that video a lot.
Me too.
Oh, I've never seen it.
About that, you know, like that specific video I've seen quite a few times, and then also like ones that are similar to that. But like, and I think it's like very staggering and very like, you know, it gets your attention and stuff like that. But it's also like very overwhelming and just like,
Yeah.
I don't know what to do. Like,
Yeah.
you know,
Exactly.
like,
Like, okay, cool.
There's no next steps.
Yeah, it's just like, okay, like, you know,
It's just, yeah.
for us, like, it's, you know, you can't imagine having that much money. Like, one, because we're only 21, that's something, like, and two, like, you know, even if, like, your parents are wealthy or something, like, you haven't, like, there's no way to, like, even think about, like, that type of money, like, in that 1% or whatever, or even, like, above that. And so I think it's just, like, hard to, like, well, then what do we do? Like, you know, like, for the average person, then what do we do?
Yeah, I was kind of like, oh, so this is how it is. Okay.
Yeah,
There's no
yeah.
call to action, no way to like try to figure it out. Just
Yeah.
information so that we're aware of how sucky it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to know and everything, but just I think every time I watch it, it's just like, okay, that's a lot. Like,
Yeah.
you know, they do it in a very clear, organized way that, you know, makes it, you know, understandable and everything. But
Pretty
it's also,
depressing.
yeah, it's just like, okay, well,
Nothing I can
Just
really
find
do. Yeah.
Find a follow-up video to go with it.
Right,
Somebody
like-
that's got that stronger call to action.
what
Yeah,
can, what
exactly.
you can do, like, to help.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly.
So,
I know, it kind of, to me, I like correlated it to Angel City and like how, like, obviously in the book, Joseph and Juan were portrayed as like living in like the bad area of LA, and like, because even though like Joseph was afraid for like Juan to like have something happen to him, like his friend, like he still, like, it kind of showed behind all of that he was unable to like get him out of that situation because he's just like stuck in that place because in not completely poverty, but he's in a poor area where he can't just make that action to move away into a nicer area of LA to keep Juan safe. And like all of him and his surrounding neighbors like hold on to love, and like that, I really liked that theme throughout the story, how like no matter like where you are on like the social class scale or like how much wealth you have, like every person has love that they can like hold on to. And I guess I like related to that, like, okay, we see this intimidating graph, like we all can relate in, you know, the human qualities, and like we, not saying, I don't know if that really like makes anything better, but yeah, I just, I guess, tried to relate like how seeing all of that in the graph, and then like then going to reading that story and like seeing like there's still a lot of good in those like poor areas or poor living situations and circumstances, that like it's not like every aspect of their life is absolutely terrible and that nothing's going to get better for them. Like there's still things that they get to focus on, and like that kind of helped me a little bit with like coping with the video and like being like, okay, I can't do anything that's going to make it completely equal and like socialism and all that jazz. But yeah, I just was encouraged by like, okay, well, they aren't in a great situation, but they still love each other. And yeah. But
I think it's about choosing your attitude too,
yeah,
which is something I noticed in the House of Scorpions a lot, was like when it was Matt's internal dialogue, there was a lot of like actively choosing, I'm not going to panic right now. I'm going to look at what I can do. Or, you know, I could ditch these friends I just made in the new city, but I'm not gonna.
Yeah, that's true. There was a lot of that internal dialogue. What did you think of Angel City?
Yeah, pretty much. I just like tried to connect it to the other thing, because I think, you know, I watched the wealth one first, and then it's like, okay, wow, and then, you know, you go to the next one, and then you kind of just like try to connect the two, because you just, I don't know, I watched them back to back, and so yeah, I guess I agreed with what you said and everything. And it kind of reminded me of a conversation that I had with some of my friends the other day, and we were talking about the Peace Corps, because a friend of a friend, whatever, long friend, is doing it, and are going to go to like somewhere in Africa to do the
Oh,
Peace
wow.
Corps. And anyway, so we were talking about it, and not with him there, but just different experiences that we've heard people do and everything. And it just kind of like, it reminded me of, because, you know, the Peace Corps, they go to a community that is in need of help, and everything. And so a lot of experiences that I've heard is that these, you know, people who are just average people here, go and do the Peace Corps, and then they get there, and the people don't really want the help. Like, they want, you know, of course they would wish to have like a better life, but they're content in where they are, and like the relationships that they have within the community, and they don't necessarily like want the change or know what change would be like. And so it made me think about like how, like, you know, it's kind of with the leaving poverty thing, like getting out of poverty, and how difficult that is, and why it's difficult, and stuff like that. And it's like, of course, like, everyone doesn't want to be in poverty. Like, of course, that's like a thing, but it's also like, you know, you have a community. And so if you were to like get out of poverty or get out of a situation, out of this community that's struggling or something, then you are losing those qualities. You're losing those relationships and stuff like that. And that's really important to humans, to have those connections and stuff like that. So it just made me think about, like, you know, going into different communities and helping, but you don't really help in a sense. And so it's like, how do you, like, how are you going to support them in a way that is more beneficial, I guess, other than coming in and like, here, let me like change what you're doing, like, and stuff. So.
That kind of reminds me of our book that we read, The City of the Beast, just because, like, I mean, obviously they were going in to infect them, but originally, you know, missionaries and like other people trying to bring them westernized stuff go in and then accidentally get them sick, because like even the common cold can like kill them. So it's like they go in exactly like what you're saying, thinking that they're going to help and like bring them our ways, and it's going to be like better for them, and then they just in the end like make it worse. So like that kind of like was similar, and I've heard like that kind of stuff a lot, you know.
Yeah, it's kind of just like that. Just, and I don't know if you necessarily have to change anything, but kind of just being aware of that aspect of, like, if as a teacher, like, if we go into like a community that is, you know, super, you know, poor or something like that, or has a lot of hardship or challenge or something like that, then it's like, we're not going to go in there and change it. No. But we can like support in ways that will help. Yeah. To ease any challenge or like a difficulty or like a sense of hurt or something like that. I don't know. Yeah. So, but like, that's just kind of like what it made me trail to think. So that wealth video, and then the angel video. Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know. It's a lot of big issues to like wrap your mind around. Yeah. And so it is.
I wonder how you could model that in a classroom, and like, because
like as a teacher, or
as a teacher, and maybe analyzing text too if it was relevant, but like how can you show, like, you don't want to just call people out and define them by their socioeconomic status, but then like if you want to help, like, I'm trying to figure out how to form this question. I'm like tripping on it.
Yeah. I was having a similar question to you, like, just like, how are the best ways to support our students without calling them out or
like acting entitled, or
exactly, like, oh, let me come down and help you where you're at, like, I'm on a different level than you, but I'm gonna try and get on your level. I don't know, like, how would be the best way to go about that? I don't know.
Probably no. Best way probably depends on like the situation, but I do think like there is like, I don't know what they are, but like, you know, just key aspects of, you know, not assuming that you know everything. And I think, you know, they make a lot of movies out of that. Like, what's it called? Shoot. The one where the teacher goes into high school class and it's like in the,
Oh, it's in like LA, and she does writing journals at them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, what's that called?
Is it like the Freedom Riders or something?
Yeah, Freedom Riders.
Yeah. Okay.
And she like the first day she like assumes that like she'll just like be able to control them and stuff, and just totally just gets like pushed back on, and just like does not. She just is like, I don't know what to do. Like, I'm done. Like, I can't do it. And so she like gets to the point of like realizing she like really has like a heart to heart with them, because they just like continue like, you're not going to teach us, like, why are you even trying, like, you know, because nobody tries on this. And so like she came in with all these assumptions that, you know, she's a good teacher, and like she's gonna like, you know, do really well, and she's gonna really make these connections with the kids, and they're gonna learn so much. And then she just like totally like there's a 360 back to like kind of like, okay, never mind, I don't know what I'm doing, like, and stuff. So I don't know. We can do that as a Medi question. If we don't know what to do. We don't.
So, you mentioned assumptions. I'm trying to think of a way to condense it in a one question. Like, how can teachers help without making assumptions, or without acting on assumptions?
You know, maybe support, teachers support students without showing any assumptions. Like, not that there should be any assumptions, but like,
but it happens.
It's such a muddy question. We can't quite form it.
There's students without.
I think that if she like watches it, she'll understand what we're asking a little better.
Without, well, stopped right. Without
acting on assumptions, I guess.
Sure. Yeah, that's good. Okay. Did anyone like have any questions while reading any of the content from this week?
I'm trying to think back to if I had any, because like Tristan said towards the beginning, that long article on socioeconomic status and stuff was probably like the hardest read for me. And
right.
I don't know. I feel like a lot of my questions were more like just comprehension of what they were saying, not so much like nutty questions, but
yeah.
Take a quick look back at that and see.
Yeah.
Or did anybody have questions after doing like their jigsaw piece?
I was kind of wondering, so now that I know that The City of the Beast was translated, but okay, we're not going to be in my classes reading it in Spanish. Most likely we'll be if I were to read a book like this, I would read it in English. But this book, once translated, wasn't necessarily well written, so I don't think it was like, you know, a well written story to read to the kids, if that makes sense. So like books with that, if like they're translated, I'm not talking about this one in specific, but other books, because there's lots of books that are translated. If the writing itself isn't necessarily the best, but the content is still something, like, should you just find a book that has better written, like is better written and has the content, or would you be okay using these types of books? Because you want, you know, to teach kids how to write well, and part of that is through reading. So if they're reading not well written text, does that make sense? What I'm saying?
Was it like when you guys read it? Was it like too distracting? Like
it was for me.
So
it would. I think maybe if you were to teach it, it would be more of like you're analyzing the writing instead of like learning.
Using it as like a text,
like as
or writing. Yeah.
Like you would use it as more.
That makes sense.
Of like if you were to look at like the actual writing of it, like the structure of the writing, or you could just have like a brief conversation about it before saying like, okay, this is a translation, and kind of learn about how translations match up.
That makes sense.
But I don't know. I mean, I think that's another good question of just like, you know, when to use books to analyze them and when to model or use them as models.
Yeah. And like when you have it split, like maybe the content is really good, but the model of how it's written isn't. So.
Right. And like this is for
or the opposite.
So like they kind of know how to write.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, obviously they can learn, but
they'd probably be old enough to understand that.
Yeah.
When books are translated, sometimes the author's original words don't stay the same.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you could also do like, you know, this book, and you could do a book from like a Native American translation or something like that, or you know, kind of compare all these different translations from different cultures, or I don't know,
and even more different, like cultural ways of talking and grammatical structures and stuff. So the translations are probably even trickier.
Right.
Because like in a lot of ways, Spanish is a lot like English.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it has the same.
Yeah.
Whatever structure, I guess. But yeah, we've even read. Well, I don't remember what the book was. But one of the books was just like, well, it's not like how we're used to reading.
Was it the
Aristotle and Dante?
No.
Might have been
Crossing Black Cheeto?
Yeah. It might have been that book, but I remember talking about.
That's right. We were thinking that it was written kind of. Like
yeah.
It was
yeah.
And it was just different than what we're used to,
right?
Like, and stuff,
right?
Which that's okay.
I
don't really have anything else.
I mean, my jigsaw was about science fiction mostly and how it's kind of its category of its own. I actually thought of this earlier when you were saying that some fantasy can be like just changing one small thing. And that kind of connected to what I read about science fiction, because it's not even necessarily that any one thing is changed except time in some science fiction. It's like we're imagining the future.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's I didn't really have a question around that, but I just thought it was really interesting that like books that were just imagining the future could be considered fantasy. And it was like, you know, they're all still based in scientific facts, and there's like, who was it, Jules Verne, like some of his science fiction novels from the late 1800s like predicted inventions that actually came to be true and stuff. And
yeah. I guess maybe a question with that could be that, you know, I was thinking when would you use certain types of fiction or fantasy? Yeah, like when would you teach? Or like, I mean, is it just choice? Like, is it just like your personal choice, or is it
when would be an appropriate time to
right?
start,
Like, or like when do you use science fantasy, or like modern fantasy, or like, you know, all those different types of fantasy? Like, when should you use those? Like, just does it depend on grade? Does it depend on like the book you use, or like when we were in?
So are you thinking like what age? Or
maybe it's like during what type of content, right? Like during what type of thing you're teaching, do you use science fiction versus fantasy?
The ELED class, when like we spent, I mean, these kids had to read, like our kids read The City of Ember, and like my group did, and it was a month-long thing.
Yeah.
And so, like, I mean, that's a huge chunk of the year that you're spending on one book, like one type of fantasy.
And they had already studied fantasy before that too, so it's like fantasy was a huge unit.
Like which, like, okay, we chose like this type of fantasy, but like, would it be better to do this type of fantasy? Or,
yeah, is there?
I don't know, like
certain fantasy type that would be
more beneficial to certain age groups or something.
Well,
there's a muddy question.
I don't have an answer in my mind, so that's a good muddy question.
I have to go to work. Yeah. Are we good on time? Oh yeah.
59.
Cool. Cool.
All right.
All right.
That's a wrap.
One more.
Ooh, one more.
Wow, that's crazy.
Have a good rest of your trip, Tristan.
Thank you. Wait, is there a way to turn it off live but still be on the video? Like turn it off?
I'll try.
Stop
We'll try.